A billionaire discovers a child reading in his library at 3 a.m. She wasn't supposed to be there. She broke his rules. What he did next, nobody could have predicted it. In a $50 million penthouse, silence isn't just valuable, it's non-negotiable. Here, billionaire Walter Harrington presides over an empire built on a single, unwavering belief. There are those who take and those who are taken from. He is a taker through and through. But at 3 a.m., his absolute control is shattered by a single, faint sound. A click. It emanates from his private library, a room where no one, and he means no one, should be. He anticipates an intruder, a thief perhaps. What he finds instead is the night shift cleaner's daughter, hidden in the shadows, completely absorbed in a complex book he can't even begin to comprehend. A girl who should be invisible, a ghost in the machine. A girl who sees everything. And he just made a fatal misjudgment. He underestimated her in a way that would soon have significant consequences. He found the child engrossed in a book that was utterly beyond him. Billionaire Walter Harrington, a man who thrived on absolute control, demanded absolute silence in his $50 million penthouse, a fortress of glass and steel that pierced the city skyline. But tonight, in the dead of night at 3 a.m., that carefully constructed silence had been violated by a tiny sound. The sound was subtle, a faint click, barely audible. It wasn't the groan of a settling pipe. It wasn't the soft hum of the climate control system. Walter Harrington knew every sound within his domain, just as intimately as he knew every asset in his sprawling portfolio. This sound was an anomaly. He had recently returned from a late-night power dinner, a self-congratulatory celebration of a deal that would pad his already overflowing coffers with another $100 million. At 58, Walter had clawed his way to the top, building an empire from the ground up, or so he claimed to the glossy magazines that chronicled his every move. He rigidly believed that the world was sharply divided into two distinct factions, those who relentlessly take and those who are relentlessly taken from. And he, without question, was a taker. His meticulously tailored suit, a masterpiece of Seville Row craftsmanship, cost more than most people earned in a year. His shoes, painstakingly handmade in Italy from the finest leather, made not a whisper of sound as he moved across the imported marble floors. He made his way from his private elevator toward the Grand Library, his senses on high alert. The penthouse was bathed in darkness, save for the cool, blue-white glow of the city lights that stretched out far below. Another click. It came from the library, confirming his suspicions. Walter's eyes narrowed, his face hardening. He paid an exorbitant premium for the most sophisticated security system money could buy. No unauthorized personnel should be on the premises, especially at this hour. His personal staff, his chef, his retinue of personal assistants, they all departed by 10 p.m. The only individual granted access to the penthouse at this late hour was the night shift cleaner, a woman whose name he had never bothered to learn, a non-entity in his world. He entered the library, his senses on high alert. The room was expansive, a monument to erudition, lined with thousands upon thousands of books he had never, and would never, read. They were purely for show, a carefully curated facade. And there, tucked away in the far corner, he spotted it. A small, flickering light, bobbing like a firefly in the darkness. It was concealed behind the large, antique globe he kept positioned by the window, a decorative touch. Walter moved with silent purpose, his irritation mounting with each step. Was the cleaner attempting to pilfer something from him? He rounded the globe, his voice sharp and accusatory, cutting through the oppressive darkness. What in God's name do you think you're doing? The light snapped off instantly. For a fleeting moment, the only sound was the soft cadence of breathing. Then, a small voice spoke, barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't hear you come in." It was a small voice, unmistakably a child's voice. Walter flipped the main light switch without hesitation. The room was instantly flooded with harsh, bright light, revealing the scene before him. She was sitting on the floor, tucked into the narrow space between the globe and a towering bookshelf. She appeared tiny and fragile, perhaps only 9 or 10 years old. She had pale blonde hair, pulled back into a simple, unadorned braid. She wore well-worn sneakers and a faded hoodie, clothes that spoke of a life lived on a tight budget. Scattered around her on the floor were not cleaning supplies, as he would have expected, but books, thick, weighty tomes that looked far too advanced for someone her age. And in her lap, clutched tightly in her hands, was the book she had been reading, illuminated by the beam of a small keychain flashlight. Walter stared at the cover, his brow furrowed in confusion. His mind, usually so razor-sharp when it came to numbers and complex financial deals, struggled to decipher the meaning. The principles of quantum mechanics. "Where is your mother?" Walter demanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. The girl didn't so much as flinch. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze with the most unsettling eyes he had ever encountered. They were a deep, intense blue, pools of quiet intelligence. They held no trace of fear, only a calm, almost unnerving, assessment. "She is in the kitchen, sir," the girl replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "She is polishing the silver. She said she would be done in 1 hour." "I don't pay her to babysit," Walter snapped, his patience wearing thin. He gestured sharply at the book in her lap. "And I certainly don't allow children to play in my library. Is this some kind of joke? What exactly are you doing with that?" The girl glanced down at the book, then back up at him, her expression unchanged. "I am reading it, sir." Walter let out a short, humorless laugh. "Reading it? Of course. And I suppose you understand it, too. Quantum mechanics, no less." The girl's face remained impassive, giving nothing away. "Most of it, sir. I am struggling with the Copenhagen interpretation. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is clear, but Bohr's concept of complementarity, it feels incomplete." Walter Harrington went completely still, the air around him seeming to crackle with a sudden, palpable tension. He looked from the girl's face down to the intimidating book in her lap, his mind reeling. He himself had a physics degree from Yale, a fact he rarely mentioned. He had been forced to endure a similar class as part of his curriculum. He had barely managed to pass, scraping by with a humiliating C-. He remembered nothing of it but headaches and frustration. And now, here he was, face to face with a 10-year-old girl in a worn-out hoodie, who was calmly discussing Niels Bohr as if he were a character from a children's cartoon. "Who are you?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, his anger barely contained. "I am Abigail Grant, sir. My mother is Emily Grant." "Get her," Walter commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now." Abigail slowly and deliberately placed a bookmark, a simple, folded piece of paper, into the dense textbook. She stood up, her movements measured and unhurried, betraying no sign of fear. She gathered the other books she had pulled from his shelves, treating them with a surprising degree of care. One was a comprehensive history of the Roman Empire. Another was a college-level calculus textbook. She walked out of the library, leaving Walter alone in the sudden, stark light, his mind racing. He felt a strange, unsettling cold sensation in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite place. He looked at the book she had left behind, lying on the floor. He picked it up, testing its weight in his hand. It was surprisingly heavy. He opened it to the page she had marked, curiosity piqued. The page was covered in equations that looked like a foreign language, a jumble of symbols that meant absolutely nothing to him. He heard frantic, hurried footsteps approaching, growing louder with each passing second. A moment later, a woman rushed into the room, wringing her hands nervously. She wore the simple, utilitarian gray uniform of the cleaning service. This was Emily Grant, the girl's mother. She was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and panic. "Mr. Harrington, sir. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." Her voice was trembling, barely audible. She was not supposed to leave the staff kitchen. Promise. Emily was 40 years old, with the same pale blonde hair as her daughter, though hers was streaked with gray and pulled back into a tight, exhausted bun. She had been working for Walter for 6 months, diligently performing her duties. She was an excellent cleaner, Efficient, quiet, practically invisible until now. She was in here, Walter said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Reading my books. Stealing, in effect. No, sir. Not stealing. Emily rushed forward, clasping her hands together in a desperate plea. She just loves to read. She's very smart. She would never take anything. I swear on my life. She paused, struggling to regain her composure. She had to come with me tonight, Mr. Harrington, Emily pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. She had a fever this morning. I couldn't leave her alone, and I cannot afford to lose this shift. The agency is very strict. I made her a small bed in the staff kitchen. I told her to sleep. I just turned my back for a minute. Walter looked at the woman, his gaze cold and unwavering. He saw weakness etched in her face. He saw desperation in her eyes. He despised both. You brought a sick child into my home, potentially exposing me to illness. She's fine now, sir. The fever broke. She's just quiet. She just reads. Please, Mr. Harrington, it will never happen again. Abigail had reappeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of her mother's distress. She stood silently, watching her mother plead for her job, her face a mask of perfect, unnerving calm. It certainly will not happen again, Walter said, his gaze shifting past the mother to focus on the child. You, he said to Abigail, his voice dripping with disdain. You think you're clever, don't you? Reading big books, playing grown-up. Abigail remained silent, refusing to engage. Let me teach you a lesson, child, Walter said, stepping closer, his presence imposing. He felt his power returning, solidifying his control over the situation. It doesn't matter how many books you read. It doesn't matter what you think you know. In this world, you are either born to rule or you are born to serve. People like you serve. You clean toilets. You polish silver. You do not read quantum physics in my library. Emily Grant gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock and horror. Sir, please. She is just a child. She is a child who needs to learn her place, Walter said, his voice like ice. Just like her mother. A flicker of something new, something unexpected, crossed Emily's face. Her fear was momentarily replaced by a spark of steel, a hint of defiance. My place, Mr. Harrington, is doing an honest night's work. It's raising my daughter to be better than me. My father fought for this country. He was a good man. He taught us that there is no shame in work. Your father, Walter scoffed, dismissively waving his hand, was probably some grunt who followed orders. I give orders. That is the difference. That is the place you fail to understand. That was the breaking point. That was when it happened. For the first time, the girl, Abigail, reacted, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. Her head snapped up, her blue eyes, no longer calm and detached, fixed intently on Walter Harrington. The look was not one of childish anger or petulant rage. It was a look of pure, concentrated ice, a chilling glimpse into the depths of her intellect. It was a look of sudden, terrible understanding, as if a complex equation had finally been solved. Walter felt that cold prickle in his chest again, the unsettling sensation that he was the one being analyzed, the one under scrutiny. For a half-second, he felt like he was the specimen under a microscope, dissected by the gaze of a child. Abby, no, her mother whispered, grabbing her arm in a futile attempt to defuse the situation. Let's go. You are fired, Walter stated, turning his back on them both, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. Of course, I want you out of my building in 5 minutes. I will inform the agency. You are never to be allowed on my properties again. Sir, please, I need this job, Emily cried, her voice laced with desperation. 5 minutes, Walter repeated, walking toward his bar to pour himself a drink, a clear indication that the conversation was over. He heard the mother begin to sob, a quiet, defeated sound that pleased him immensely. He heard her take her daughter's hand, signaling their retreat. Come on, baby, we have to get our things. He listened to their footsteps recede, the sounds echoing in the otherwise silent penthouse. The mother's footsteps were hurried and broken, filled with despair. The daughter's footsteps were slow and measured, betraying no emotion. As she reached the doorway, Abigail stopped, pausing for a moment. She turned and looked back at Walter Harrington, her gaze unwavering. He was standing with his back to her, admiring the glittering city lights that stretched out before him. A glass of expensive brandy cradled in his hand. He hadn't even acknowledged her presence. She did not say a word, but her mind was working at lightning speed, processing information, cataloging details. She was not just a girl who liked physics, a precocious child with a knack for science. Abigail Grant possessed a unique and extraordinary gift, a gift her mother affectionately called her memory trick. Doctors called it eidetic memory or photographic memory. Abigail, in her own words, called it the library in her head. She never forgot anything she saw or heard, a remarkable ability that had served her well. For 6 months, while waiting for her mother to finish her grueling shifts, she had been watching, observing, absorbing everything around her. She had waited patiently in the staff kitchen, but sometimes, when the opportunity presented itself, her mother had allowed her to sit quietly in the study while she vacuumed the main hall, provided she didn't get in the way. Abigail had seen the papers scattered across Walter's imposing desk. She had seen the complex diagrams scribbled on his whiteboards, a chaotic mess to the untrained eye. She had overheard the phone calls he took on his speakerphone, his voice booming throughout the room as he shouted about zoning changes and leveraged buyouts. To her, initially, they were just shapes and sounds, meaningless puzzles, random strings of numbers. But tonight, the man who owned those numbers had insulted her mother, had treated her with utter contempt. And worse, he had insulted her grandfather, a man she deeply admired. Michael Grant was not some grunt. He was a decorated war hero, a veteran who had served his country with honor and distinction. He was the kindest, strongest man Abigail had ever known, a moral compass in a world that often seemed to lack direction. He was the one who had taught her to read, patiently sounding out words until she grasped their meaning. He was the one who had always told her that her extraordinary mind was a gift, not a burden, a source of strength to be nurtured and cherished. As Abigail stood in the doorway, her mind racing, she focused her attention on the desk across the hall. She saw a file left carelessly open, its contents exposed. She saw a name prominently displayed, Harrington Global, and next to it a list of other names, some familiar, some she didn't immediately recognize. Apex Holdings, Clearwater Investments, Project Nightingale. She took a mental snapshot, capturing the information with perfect clarity. Click. She shifted her gaze to the whiteboard in his study, the one he hadn't bothered to erase, a glaring oversight. It was a complex map of money moving between boxes, a tangled web of financial transactions. Click. She vividly remembered the phone call from last week, the one where Mr. Harrington had laughed with a chilling lack of empathy and said, "Councilman Davies is greedier than he looks. Double the consulting fee, and the waterfront project is ours." Click. Abigail Grant turned and walked away, her resolve hardening with each step. She was not just a girl who understood quantum physics. She was a girl who now had a reason, a burning, righteous reason, to understand Walter Harrington, to dissect his actions and uncover his secrets. And he, in his arrogance and hubris, had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Walter Harrington watched the elevator doors slide shut with a soft whoosh, sealing the two women inside. He heard the faint, muffled sound of Emily Grant sobbing on the other side, her despair a soothing balm to his wounded ego. Incompetence, he muttered to himself, shaking his head in disgust. He took a long, deliberate sip of his brandy, savoring the taste. The liquid was smooth and fiery, warming him from the inside out, a rare vintage costing upwards of $2,000 a bottle. It usually had a calming effect, easing his anxieties and restoring his sense of control. Tonight, however, it did not. The unease lingered. He walked back into the library, his mind still preoccupied with the encounter. He looked at the chair where the small blonde girl had been sitting, the chair that now seemed tainted by her presence. He saw the book she had left on the floor, a silent accusation, The Principles of Quantum Mechanics. He nudged it with his expensive shoe, treating it with contempt. Heisenberg, he scoffed, his voice laced with mockery. Bore. Ridiculous. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation, a prickling sensation that ran beneath his skin. It wasn't outright anger at the child, although he certainly felt a degree of annoyance. It was something more subtle, more insidious. It was the faint, nagging feeling that he was the one who had been looked down on, the one who had been judged and found wanting. That calm, unwavering, blue-eyed stare. It had not been fearful or intimidated. It had been analytical, almost clinical, as if he were the specimen under a microscope, a subject of detached scientific inquiry. A 10-year-old, he said aloud, his voice echoing in the cavernous, empty room, betraying his frustration. He grabbed the book and shoved it violently back onto the shelf, disregarding its proper place. He did not care that he put it in the wrong section, that he disrupted the meticulously organized collection. He was Walter Harrington. He did not make mistakes. He crushed them, eradicating them from existence with ruthless efficiency. He finished his drink in one swift gulp, forcing the woman and her strange, unsettling child out of his mind, banishing them from his thoughts. He went to his study, determined to regain his composure and refocus his attention. He had a deal to close, a fortune to be made. The waterfront project was moving forward, inching closer to completion. He picked up the phone to call his lawyers, eager to finalize the details, forgetting entirely about the incriminating diagram he had carelessly left on his whiteboard, a silent witness to his unethical dealings. Inside the elevator, the moment the polished brass doors closed with a reassuring thud, Emily Grant's legs gave out, unable to support her weight any longer. She slumped against the mahogany-paneled wall, her body trembling uncontrollably, and slid to the floor, her sobs echoing in the small, confined space, amplifying her despair. "Oh, Abby. Oh, my girl. What are we going to do?" The elevator was descending, carrying them down, 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 away from the opulence of the penthouse. 50 floors. "I've lost it. I've lost the best-paying job I've ever had," she cried, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, Lord. The rent is due on the 1st, the electric bill." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs, completely overwhelmed by the precariousness of her situation. He was such a vile man. Abigail did not cry. She stood perfectly still, her posture erect, her gaze fixed on the illuminated numbers as they ticked down, floor by floor. She was not thinking about the rent or the looming threat of eviction. She was not thinking about the electric bill or the fear of being plunged into darkness. In her mind, she was still in the penthouse, replaying the scene with perfect clarity, scrutinizing every detail. She was re-watching the encounter with Mr. Harrington like a movie, running it back, frame by frame, analyzing his every word, every gesture. She saw Mr. Harrington's face, contorted with disdain. She heard his voice, dripping with condescension. "You are born to serve. You clean toilets." And she was meticulously reviewing the data she had collected, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered over the past 6 months. The whiteboard in his study. It was a flowchart, a visual representation of a complex network, a box at the top labeled H Global, the apex of the pyramid. Arrows pointed down to 3 smaller boxes, representing subsidiary companies: Apex Holdings, Clearwater Investments, Project Nightingale. Money flowed from the smaller boxes to the big one, but arrows also pointed sideways to a box labeled CD Consulting, a name that piqued her curiosity. Click. The file on his desk, left carelessly open, revealing its secrets. A list of property deeds, all conveniently located along the waterfront. Click. The phone call from last week, the one she had overheard while quietly reading in the kitchen. He had used his speakerphone, his voice loud and booming, filling the room. "Councilman Davies is greedier than he looks. Double the consulting fee, and the waterfront project is ours." CD, Councilman Davies. The elevator chimed softly, signaling their arrival, the doors gliding open to reveal the grand, empty lobby. The night security guard, a kind-faced man named Frank, looked up from his desk, startled by their sudden appearance. He saw Emily's tear-streaked face, etched with exhaustion and despair. He looked at Abigail, pale and silent, her eyes unreadable. "Mrs. Grant, everything all right?" Frank was a kind and compassionate man, always willing to lend a helping hand. He always gave Abigail a piece of hard candy when she came in, a small gesture of kindness that she deeply appreciated. I've been let go, Frank," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her body for warmth. Frank's face fell, his expression conveying his disappointment and concern. He knew what a late-night firing from Mr. Harrington meant, the devastating consequences it could have on a person's life. "Oh, Emily, I'm so sorry." He paused, considering their situation. "It's 3:30 in the morning. How are you getting home? Is the bus still running?" Emily said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to regain her composure. "We'll be fine. The last bus doesn't run for another hour," Frank said, looking at the clock on the wall. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his wallet, pulling out a crumpled $10 bill. "Here," he said, pressing it into her hand. "Take a cab, please." "Oh, Frank, I couldn't," she protested, her voice filled with gratitude and reluctance. He insisted, gently closing her fingers around the money. "For the little one. It's a cold night." Emily burst into a fresh round of tears, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Thank you, Frank. God bless you." Abigail looked at the guard, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Thank you, Mr. Frank," she said, her voice flat, but her eyes conveying a depth of emotion that belied her stoic demeanor. She met his gaze, acknowledging his kindness, etching his face into her memory. Click. They pushed through the heavy glass doors, leaving the warmth of the lobby behind. The air outside was cold and damp, clinging to their skin. The city was quiet and still, the streets deserted. The gleaming tower of the Harrington building rose behind them, a monument of dark glass, a symbol of power and wealth. They did not take a cab, despite Frank's generous offer. A cab cost too much, a luxury they could not afford. Frank's $10 would be used for something more essential, something more pressing. Bread and milk, the staples of their meager existence. They walked the 6 long blocks to the bus stop, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. They sat on the cold metal bench, shivering in the damp air, their bodies aching with fatigue. Emily shivered, pulling Abigail close to her, seeking comfort and warmth. "We'll be okay, Abby," she said, her voice filled with forced optimism. "I'll find something. I'll call the agency first thing in the morning. Maybe I can get 2 3-day jobs. It will be all right." Abigail leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, seeking solace in her touch. She felt her mother trembling, her body racked with exhaustion and worry. In her mind, she was calculating, analyzing, strategizing, consulting fee, waterfront project, Councilman Davies. She was 10 years old, a child prodigy who possessed an intellect far beyond her years. She understood quantum mechanics, the intricacies of the universe. She did not understand bribes or the corrupt machinations of powerful men. Not yet, but she understood that Mr. Harrington had secrets he was desperately trying to protect. And she understood that he used his power to hurt people, to exploit and manipulate those around him. He had hurt her mother, unfairly dismissing her from her job. He had hurt Mr. Frank, a kind and decent man who was clearly afraid of him. And he had insulted her grandfather, the man he had so callously called a grunt, a term of utter disrespect. The bus finally came, rattling to a stop in front of them, its headlights illuminating the darkness. They were the only passengers on board, their presence a stark contrast to the emptiness of the vehicle. The ride took 40 minutes, a slow and monotonous journey through the sleeping city. They moved from the clean, wide streets of downtown, the domain of the wealthy and powerful, to the narrow, cracked streets of their own impoverished neighborhood, a world apart. They got off the bus and walked 2 blocks to their apartment building, their footsteps heavy with fatigue. It was an old, 3-story brick building, its facade worn and weathered, a testament to years of neglect. The paint was peeling, revealing the bare brick beneath. They climbed the creaking stairs to their 2nd-floor apartment, their bodies aching with each step. Emily's hand shook as she fumbled with the key, trying to insert it into the lock. She opened the door, revealing the small, but meticulously clean, apartment. A worn-out sofa, a relic of better days. A small, outdated television, their only source of entertainment. A lingering smell of coffee and old books, a comforting aroma. A light was on in the kitchen, casting a warm glow. "Emily? Abby? Is that you?" A man's voice, warm but tired, emanated from the kitchen. An older man walked out of the kitchen, his movements slow and deliberate. He was tall, but he leaned heavily on a wooden cane, his body weakened by age and injury. He wore simple pajamas and a faded blue bathrobe, his attire reflecting his humble circumstances. This was Michael Grant, Abigail's grandfather. He was 72 years old, a veteran of countless battles, both on the field and in life. His hair was snow white, a stark contrast to his deeply tanned skin, but his eyes were the same deep, sharp blue as his granddaughter's, pools of quiet intelligence and unwavering determination. He had been a captain in the army, a leader of men. He had served 2 tours of duty, witnessing the horrors of war firsthand. He had a pin in his hip, a constant reminder of his sacrifices. And he had a chest full of medals, carefully preserved in a wooden box, symbols of his bravery and service. He saw Emily's face, red and swollen from crying, her expression betraying her distress. He saw Abigail's pale and set face, her silence more eloquent than words. "Emily? What's wrong? What happened?" Emily's composure broke again, the dam finally bursting. She fell into her father's arms, seeking comfort and support, her story tumbling out in a rush of sobs and whispers, a torrent of pent-up emotion. He found her, "Dad, in the library," she said, her voice choked with tears. "He said such awful things. He called her. He called me. And he fired me. He fired me, Dad. I don't know what to do." Michael Grant held his daughter close, offering her a silent embrace, a source of unwavering strength. He looked over her head at Abigail, who was standing in the doorway, watching them with a mixture of concern and stoicism. His face, usually so kind and gentle, hardened, not with anger, but with a deep, cold sorrow, a weariness that came from years of witnessing the darkness of the world. He had seen men like Walter Harrington before, on battlefields and in boardrooms, men who confused power with character, who mistook wealth for worth. "Hush, Emily," he said softly, patting her back with a comforting gesture. "It's all right. We're all right. You're home. You're safe." He helped his daughter to the sofa, guiding her gently. "Let me make you some tea. Abby, go get your mother a blanket from her bed." "Yes, Grandpa," Abigail said, her voice quiet and obedient. She walked down the short hallway, her footsteps barely audible. Their apartment had 2 bedrooms, small and cramped, but filled with love and warmth. Her mother and grandfather had the rooms, a testament to their selflessness. Abigail slept on a small cot in the living room, sectioned off by a curtain for privacy, her own little sanctuary in the shared space. But her room was a tiny closet she had converted into a personal haven, a place where she could escape into the world of books and ideas. She went to her mother's room and pulled the heavy quilt from the bed, the warmth of the fabric a comforting presence. As she walked back, she passed her own little space, her sanctuary of books and learning. She stopped, drawn by an invisible force. She looked at her mother, who was now quietly weeping on the sofa, her body shaking with exhaustion and despair. She looked at her grandfather, who was standing in the kitchen, his back to her, his shoulders set with a determined resolve. He was filling a kettle with water, preparing to make tea, a simple act of comfort. His hand, the one not on the cane, was clenched into a fist, his knuckles white with tension. Abigail did not go back to the living room, did not offer her mother the blanket. She ducked behind her curtain, stepping into her own private world. There was a small desk, barely big enough for a notebook and a pencil. A reading light cast a pool of illumination, creating a cozy atmosphere. And a shelf, crammed with books, not children's toys or frivolous distractions, but stacks of books, old paperbacks, biographies, history books, math textbooks she had salvaged from the thrift store, treasures rescued from obscurity. She pulled out a simple spiral-bound notebook, the kind used for school, the pages crisp and clean. She sat at her desk, her posture perfect, her back straight. She opened the notebook to a clean page, ready to begin. She took a pencil, its graphite tip sharp and precise. Her hand was perfectly steady, betraying no sign of the turmoil raging within her. At the top of the page, she wrote a name, her handwriting neat and legible. Walter Harrington. Then, she began to draw, her mind racing, her memory crystal clear. She drew the flowchart from the whiteboard, recreating it with meticulous detail, capturing every nuance. H Global, the apex of the pyramid. The three boxes underneath it, representing the subsidiary companies. Apex Holdings, Clearwater Investments, Project Nightingale. She drew the arrows, illustrating the flow of money, the intricate web of financial transactions. And she drew the box to the side, the one that had piqued her curiosity. CD Consulting. Underneath it, she wrote the words she remembered, the incriminating phrases she had overheard, the fragments of information that were beginning to coalesce into a coherent picture. Councilman Davies. Waterfront Project. Double the consulting fee. She listed the file name she had seen on his desk, the list of property deeds, all conveniently located along the waterfront. She listed the dates, the times, the locations, every detail she could recall. She was not a child anymore, not in that moment. She was a witness, a recorder of events, a gatherer of evidence. She filled one page, then another, her hand moving with incredible speed and precision. The library in her head was downloading the information, processing the data, connecting the dots. She wrote down every detail she could remember from the past 6 months. The license plates of the expensive cars that had visited the Harrington building, the names she had heard shouted on the phone, the scraps of paper she had seen discarded in his wastebasket before her mother emptied it, the seemingly insignificant details that now seemed to carry immense weight. She was so focused, so completely absorbed in her task, that she did not hear her grandfather approach, his footsteps muffled by the rug. Michael Grant stood in the opening of her curtain, leaning heavily on his cane for support. He had brought her a small glass of milk, a comforting gesture. He stopped, his gaze drawn to the notebook, the pages filled with diagrams and names. He saw the intricate flowchart, the map of money moving between boxes. He saw the names of the individuals and companies involved. He was a veteran, a soldier trained in strategy and tactics. He knew what he was looking at, even without understanding the specifics. It was not a child's drawing, not a random collection of scribbles. It was a map, a plan of action, a blueprint for something far more significant. "Abigail," he said, his voice very quiet, barely a whisper. Abigail jumped, startled by his sudden appearance, her hand flying to cover the page, protecting her secrets. "It's just me, sweetheart," Michael said gently, his tone reassuring. He sat on the edge of her cot, the springs creaking softly under his weight. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face, probing her thoughts. "Your mother told me what he said about me." Abigail's lower lip trembled, the first sign of the child breaking through her stoic facade. "He said you were a grunt," she whispered, her voice filled with pain. "He said people like us serve." She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. "He said it like we were dirt." "He is a fool, Abby," Michael said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "A man's worth is not in his bank account. It is in his word, in his honor." He paused, his gaze hardening. "That man has no honor." He pointed to the notebook. "What is this, sweetie?" Abigail hesitated, Only her grandfather knew about her memory trick. He was the one who helped her manage it. He was the one who had told her it was a gift from God. It's his secrets, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's a bad man. He hurt Mom," he said. "You followed orders, but he's the one doing bad things. I think he's a criminal." Michael Grant looked at the page again, his brow furrowed in concern. He read the name Councilman Davies. His blood ran cold. Davies. He knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. A politician who always seemed to vote in favor of rich developers while neighborhoods like theirs crumbled into disrepair. And Project Nightingale. Michael had read about that in the newspaper. A charity Harrington Global was supposedly funding to build a new hospital wing. Michael had thought it was a genuinely good thing, but here it was linked to Apex Holdings, linked to CD Consulting. Michael immediately understood it was not a charity at all. It was a way to move money, to launder it, to make it appear legitimate. He looked at his 10-year-old granddaughter, a mixture of pride and disbelief washing over him. She had, in a single night, uncovered what seasoned investigative journalists had been trying to prove for years, their efforts thwarted at every turn. "Abby," he said, his voice heavy with a mix of concern and admiration. He placed his large, worn hand over hers, his touch both protective and grounding. "This is very dangerous. You understand that, don't you?" "He's a bully," Abigail said, her voice small but surprisingly hard, a steely determination underlying her words. "You taught me to stand up to bullies." "I did," Michael said, his gaze softening slightly. "But this is a different kind of bully. This is a man who can crush people without ever laying a hand on them." He looked at Emily, asleep on the sofa, exhausted from crying. "He just crushed your mother." "I want to crush him," Abigail said, her voice laced with an intensity that belied her young age. Michael looked at her, startled by the cold fury in her voice. He saw himself in her. He saw that same iron will, that same unwavering commitment to justice. "Justice isn't about crushing people, Abby," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's about balance. It's about making things right." He tapped the notebook. This is just information. It's not proof. Not yet. A child's memory isn't enough to stop a man like that." "Then we get proof," Abigail said, her eyes fixed on his with unwavering resolve. Michael sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He looked around the small, poor apartment, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. He looked at his brilliant granddaughter, her potential boundless yet her safety fragile. Walter Harrington had made a terrible mistake, a miscalculation that would likely haunt him. He had not just insulted a cleaner, a woman struggling to make ends meet. He had not just insulted a veteran, a man who had served his country with honor. He had given them a reason to fight back, a cause to rally around. "First," Michael said, closing the notebook, his voice firm, "we need to survive. Your mother needs a job. We need to pay the rent. We cannot fight a war if we cannot even afford to eat." "And then?" Abigail asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Michael looked at the notebook, his eyes narrowing in determination. "And then we find someone who knows how to read your map, someone who can help us navigate this treacherous terrain." The next morning, the small apartment was filled with the aroma of old coffee, a comforting scent that belied the tension in the air, and the quiet hum of the television news, a constant backdrop to their lives. Emily Grant was already dressed, her face scrubbed clean, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She had ironed her best blouse, a subtle attempt to project an image of competence and confidence despite the turmoil within. "I'll call the agency first thing," she said, her voice strained with a forced optimism that did little to mask her underlying anxiety. "Mrs. Gable likes me. She'll find me a new placement. Maybe a day shift so I can be home when you get back from school." Abigail, sitting at the kitchen table, did not look up from her math homework, her focus laser-sharp. She was already working on the 8th grade curriculum, her mind racing far ahead of her peers. "Yes, Mom," she replied, her voice barely audible. Michael sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on his daughter. He knew what was coming. He had seen this kind of power play before, witnessed its devastating effects firsthand during his time in the military. A powerful man like Harrington didn't just fire someone. He made an example of them, sending a clear message to anyone who dared cross his path. Emily dialed the number, her hand trembling slightly. She stepped into her bedroom for privacy, but the apartment was small, and their lives were intertwined. They heard everything. "Mrs. Gable?" she said, her voice polite and hopeful, tinged with a desperate plea. "Hello, it's Emily Grant." There was a long silence on the other end, a silence that spoke volumes. "Ooh, I see," Emily said, her voice smaller now, the hope draining away with each passing second. "Mrs. Gable, I promise it was a misunderstanding. My daughter, she wandered. She didn't take anything. Another silence, even longer this time, punctuated by the faint sounds of Mrs. Gable's voice on the other end, a voice that carried a message of finality and regret. "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice cracking under the weight of the impending blow. "Terminated from the roster?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been with you for 3 years. I have never had a single complaint. Not one." Michael closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable fallout. Abigail's pencil stopped moving, her attention fully focused on the unfolding drama. Because of one client. Emily was crying now, her voice choked with emotion. "But Mr. Harrington, that's not fair. I have a child to feed. Please, Mrs. Gable, please just don't do this." The click of the phone hanging up was loud in the quiet apartment, a sound that reverberated through their lives, shattering the fragile peace they had managed to maintain. Emily walked out of the bedroom, her face pale and drawn, as if she had aged years in a matter of minutes. She looked like a ghost, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond tears, a deep-seated fear that threatened to consume her. "He didn't just fire me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He blacklisted me. The agency. They terminated my contract. Severe client complaint. Breach of trust. He ruined me, Dad." She slid into a chair at the table, her hands flat on the surface, as if seeking stability in the face of overwhelming despair. "He ruined me." "No, he didn't," Michael said, his voice firm and unwavering, a beacon of strength in the midst of their chaos. He put his hand on her shoulder, his touch offering a sense of reassurance and support. "He is one man in one city. You are a hard worker. You are an honest woman. You will find something else." What will I find?" she said, her voice rising in panic, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Everywhere asks for references. The agency was my only reference for the last 3 years. He cut my legs out from under me. For what? Because his library was disturbed by a 10-year-old girl?" Abigail looked at her mother, her heart aching with a mixture of guilt and empathy. She saw the raw, shaking fear that gripped her, a fear that transcended the pages of her storybooks. This was not like in the books. In books, the heroes were never afraid of rent. They were never afraid of the electric bill. This, she realized with a chilling clarity, was what Mr. Harrington had done. He hadn't just used cruel words. He had used his power like a hammer to smash her mother's life, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. Abigail quietly closed her math book, her mind already racing with plans for retaliation. She opened the notebook from last night, the one with the diagrams and cryptic notes, the one that held the key to Harrington's empire. She looked at her grandfather, her eyes filled with a silent determination. Michael met her gaze, his eyes reflecting her resolve. He gave a single, slow nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared purpose. "Emily," he said, his voice regaining its strength, "you go out, you pound the pavement, you apply at every diner, every grocery store, every hotel in this city. You hold your head high. You are a Grant. We do not break." Emily looked at her father, her eyes searching his for a sign of hope. She saw the steel in his eyes, the unwavering determination that had carried him through countless battles. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her body still trembling but her spirit slowly beginning to mend. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "Okay, I will." She stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out the door, her steps hesitant but her purpose renewed. The moment the door closed, Michael turned to Abigail, his demeanor shifting from concern to determination. "All right, soldier," he said, his voice dropping to a lower register, a tone that spoke of strategy and action. "Our turn. Get your coat. We're going to the library." The public library was 10 blocks away, a familiar and comforting destination for Abigail. It was warm and it smelled of old paper and floor polish, a scent that evoked memories of countless hours spent lost in the pages of her favorite books. It was one of Abigail's favorite places, a sanctuary of knowledge and imagination. But today, this was not a visit for pleasure. This was a mission, a strategic maneuver in their fight against a powerful adversary. Michael led her to the computer terminals in the back, their glow illuminating the rows of focused faces. "This is our new base of operations, Abby," he said, sitting heavily in one of the plastic chairs, his joints protesting with a familiar ache. "We have what I call raw intelligence, your notebook. Now, we need to confirm it. We need to find out who these people are. We need to find a weak link, a vulnerability that we can exploit." Abigail sat at the computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with remarkable speed and precision. She was faster than any of the librarians, her knowledge of the digital world far surpassing their own. "Start with the names you wrote down," Michael guided her, his voice a low murmur, careful not to attract unwanted attention. "Councilman Davies and Harrington Global. Search them together." Abigail typed the keywords into the search engine, her eyes scanning the screen as it filled with articles, press releases, and images. Pictures of Walter Harrington and a smiling, slick-looking man, Councilman Davies, shaking hands, their faces radiating an air of mutual admiration. They were at a press conference for the new waterfront revitalization project, a project that promised to bring jobs and prosperity to the city but also threatened to displace countless residents. "Mr. Harrington is a pillar of this community. His generosity is unmatched," Michael read aloud, quoting Davies' words with a hint of sarcasm. "Now search Project Nightingale," Michael said, his eyes narrowing. Abigail typed again, her fingers moving with practiced ease. The results were fewer this time, a sign that the project was not as widely publicized. A small website appeared, its design simple and understated. It described Project Nightingale as a new charitable foundation dedicated to building a state-of-the-art children's wing at the city hospital, a noble cause that tugged at the heartstrings of potential donors. The project was funded entirely by a generous anonymous donation from a prominent city businessman, a detail that raised Michael's suspicions. "An anonymous donation?" Michael scoffed, a hint of disdain in his voice. "A man like Harrington doesn't do anything anonymously. He wants his name on the building, plastered in gold letters for all to see, unless he doesn't want anyone to know where the money is coming from." "Go deeper, Abby," he urged, his voice filled with anticipation. "Who is on the board of directors for Project Nightingale? Let's see who's involved in this charade." Abigail clicked through the site, navigating the maze of links and pages with ease. She found the About Us page, a section designed to instill trust and credibility. She found the list of board members, a short list that consisted of only a few key players. A president, a secretary, and a treasurer, the bare minimum required to operate a non-profit organization. "Now," Michael said, leaning in, his voice barely audible above the hum of the computers. "Open a new window. Search for the other companies on your list. Apex Holdings and Clearwater Investments. Let's see if we can find any connections, any overlapping interests." Abigail searched for Apex Holdings, her fingers flying across the keyboard. It was a simple one-page website, a stark contrast to the polished image of Harrington Global. A financial group, its mission vague and undefined. She looked at the Our Team page, her eyes scanning the rows of names and faces. She found the CEO. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it, Abby?" Michael asked, his voice filled with concern. sensing the change in her demeanor. "Grandpa," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The CEO of Apex Holdings. His name is Robert Shaw. He's the same man listed as the treasurer for Project Nightingale." Michael's eyes lit up with a cold fire, a spark of triumph in the face of adversity. "Got him?" he breathed, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. "That's the bridge. That's how he's moving the money, connecting the dots. Harrington gives the bribe to Davies. Davies, through some channel, donates it to Project Nightingale. The charity then pays Apex Holdings, Harrington's own company, for financial management or construction fees. He's laundering it, making dirty money clean." Abigail looked at her grandfather, her face grim with understanding. "He's stealing." "He's doing worse than that, Abby," Michael said, his voice filled with righteous anger. "He's stealing from the city, from the people who need it most. He's using a children's hospital to hide it, preying on people's good nature and generosity." He paused, his eyes hardening with determination. "That is the man who called your mother a servant, who dismissed her worth as a human being." Abigail's face was grim, her small features set in a mask of determination. She looked back at the screen, her mind racing with possibilities. "We have the how, Grandpa," she said, echoing his words from last night. "But we don't have proof. This just looks suspicious. It's not proof." "You are right," Michael said, his voice filled with admiration for her sharp intellect. He stared at the screen, his mind working, searching for a way to turn suspicion into concrete evidence. He was back on the battlefield, strategizing, looking for an opening, a vulnerability that he could exploit. "We are two civilians. We have no power. We have a 10-year-old's memory and a public computer. We can't fight him head-on. It would be a slaughter, a David and Goliath story with a predictable ending." "So what do we do?" Abigail asked, her eyes fixed on his, seeking guidance and direction. "We find an insurgent," Michael said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "We find someone who already has weapons but no ammunition, someone who has been wronged by Harrington and is looking for a way to strike back. We need a reporter, someone who already hates Harrington, someone he's already hurt, someone who has a personal stake in bringing him down." Abigail turned back to the keyboard, her fingers flying across the keys, her mind already focused on the task at hand. She knew what to search for. She typed "Walter Harrington lawsuit reporter" into the search engine, her eyes scanning the results. The screen was filled with links, a testament to Harrington's litigious nature. Harrington, it seemed, sued reporters often, using his vast resources to silence his critics and protect his image. But one name kept appearing, a name that resonated with Michael. A man named David Chun. Chun had been a star investigative journalist for the city's top newspaper, The Chronicle, a reporter known for his tenacity and his unwavering commitment to the truth. 3 years ago, he had written a blistering series of articles that had sent shockwaves through the city's elite. He accused Walter Harrington of exactly this, using shell companies and political bribes to secure a massive downtown real estate deal, a deal that would enrich Harrington and his cronies at the expense of the city's residents. "This is it, Abby," Michael said, his voice urgent, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "This is our man." Abigail clicked on the links, her heart pounding with anticipation. The first few articles were explosive, filled with accusations, hints at sources inside, and leaked documents. They painted a damning picture of Harrington's corrupt practices, exposing his network of influence and his willingness to break the law to achieve his goals. Then the articles stopped abruptly, the investigation seemingly abandoned without explanation. The last link was from 2.5 years ago, a small 2-paragraph item buried on an inner page of the paper. "Retraction," the headline said. "The Chronicle formally apologized to Mr. Walter Harrington for its unsubstantiated reporting by David Chun. Mr. Chun was no longer employed by the newspaper. He crushed him," Abigail said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Just like he's trying to crush your mother," Michael said, his voice laced with bitterness. "Harrington sued him, bled him dry, and destroyed his career. He made an example of him just like he did with Emily, sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge his power. Michael stared at the name David Chun, his mind already formulating a plan. "This is our man," Michael said, his voice filled with conviction. "A man with nothing left to lose. A man who wants revenge just as much as we want justice." "How do we find him?" Abigail asked, her eyes searching his for answers. "A good reporter never really quits," Michael said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. "He just goes underground, waiting for the right opportunity to resurface." It took another hour of searching, sifting through online directories and social media profiles, but they finally found him. David Chun was not at the Chronicle anymore. He was not at any paper. He ran a small, independent blog, a lonely outpost in the vast expanse of the internet. It looked old, its design outdated, and its content largely ignored. It was just text, a stark contrast to the flashy websites of the mainstream media. He posted about city council meetings, zoning laws, and budget reports, topics that few people cared about. Nobody read it, but he kept writing, driven by a sense of duty and a burning desire to expose the truth. His headquarters was listed as a P.O. box, a sign of his anonymity and his desire to avoid unwanted attention. But at the very bottom of the page, almost hidden from view, there was a contact link and a phone number. Michael wrote it down on a scrap of paper, his heart pounding with anticipation. That night, the apartment was dark, except for the dim light over the stove, a symbol of their dwindling resources. Emily had returned, her feet aching, her face a mask of defeat. She had handed out 12 resumes, filled out 8 applications. Not one person had called her back. She had eaten a small bowl of soup, her appetite diminished by stress and anxiety, and fallen asleep on the sofa, still in her clothes, too exhausted to even change. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. The only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. He looked at the scrap of paper with the phone number, his gaze fixed on the digits as if they held the key to their salvation. He looked at Abigail, who was sitting across from him, her notebook open, her pen poised to record every detail. "Abigail," Michael said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "You need to understand what we're doing. This is the point of no return. Once I make this call, we are in the fight, fully committed to a battle against a powerful and ruthless enemy. It will be dangerous. This man, Harrington, he won't just fire us. He will try to destroy us, to erase us from existence. All of us. Your mother, too." Abigail looked at her mother, asleep on the sofa, her face etched with worry. She looked at the past due notice for the electric bill, which Emily had left on the table, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. "He is already destroying us, Grandpa," Abigail said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "We have nothing left to lose." Michael looked at her, his heart aching with a terrible mix of pride and fear. She was his blood, his legacy. She was a soldier, ready to face the enemy with unwavering courage. "You're right," he said, his voice regaining its strength. He picked up the old kitchen phone, its plastic yellowed with age. He took a deep, steadying breath, his hand trembling slightly. His fingers, calloused from years of hard work and gnarled from arthritis, slowly dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring echoing through the silent apartment, each ring increasing the tension in the air. A man answered, his voice rough, tired, and full of suspicion. "Yeah?" he said, his tone guarded. "Mr. Chun," Michael said, his voice firm and steady. "Mr. David Chun? Who's asking?" the man replied, his voice laced with skepticism. "My name is Michael Grant. You don't know me, sir, but I believe we have a mutual acquaintance." There was a silence on the other end, a long, pregnant pause that spoke volumes about the man on the other end of the line. "I'm not a reporter anymore, old man," David Chun finally said, his voice filled with a deep-seated weariness. "I don't know what you're selling, but I'm not buying. I've heard it all before. Empty promises and dead ends. I am not selling anything, Mr. Chun, Michael said, his voice hard as iron, his words cutting through the skepticism. I am offering you something. I'm offering you the man who ruined your life, the man who stole your career and left you for dead. Another long, heavy silence, punctuated by the faint sound of David Chun's breathing. Walter Harrington, Michael said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. Abigail watched her grandfather, her eyes fixed on his every move. He was sitting straighter now, his back ramrod, his eyes gleaming with determination. He was no longer just an old man with a cane. He was a warrior, ready to fight for what he believed in. I'm listening, David Chun finally said, his voice barely audible. There was a long, pressurized silence on the phone line, a silence that crackled with unspoken tension. David Chun was breathing but not speaking, his mind racing, weighing the risks and the potential rewards. Mr. Chun, Michael said, his voice breaking the silence. How do I know you're not one of his? How do I know this isn't some trap to sue me again, to silence me once and for all? I've got nothing left for him to take, but I'm sure his lawyers could find something, some way to make my life even more miserable. You don't know me, Michael said, his voice steady and resolute. But you know him. You know how he operates, his ruthlessness, his arrogance, his willingness to stop at nothing to protect his interests. You wrote 3 articles about his shell companies, exposing his corrupt practices for all to see. You were right. You just didn't have the final piece of the puzzle. We have it, he said, his voice filled with conviction. Who is we? Chun asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. My family. People he hurt because he could, people he underestimated. He hurt a lot of people, Mr. Grant, but that doesn't make you special. We're the only ones who have been inside his penthouse for the last 6 months. Watching, listening, gathering information, Michael said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. Another silence, but this one was different. It was the sound of a hunter's ears perking up, the sound of a man who had been dormant for too long suddenly coming alive. Where? Chun finally said, his voice filled with a newfound intensity. Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, the City Public Library, the main branch on 5th, History Section, 2nd floor, European Theater, Michael said, his voice calm and controlled. That's very specific, Chun said, his suspicion still lingering. I am a veteran, Michael said simply. I like history. I'll be the one with a cane reading about the Battle of the Bulge. You'll know me. And how will I know you're alone? How will I know this isn't some kind of setup? Chun asked, his voice still guarded. You won't, Michael said, his voice unwavering. You'll just have to trust that the man who ruined your life is worth the risk. We'll be there for 20 minutes. If you're not there, we'll find another way. We will find justice with or without your help. Michael Grant hung up the phone, his hand shaking slightly. He did not wait for a reply. He had said what he needed to say, and now it was up to David Chun to make a choice. He looked at Abigail, her face pale in the dim kitchen light, but her eyes bright with determination. Now we prepare, Michael said, his voice firm. Go to your room. Write it all down. Everything you remember, names, dates, times, every number, every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem. Do not write your opinions. Do not write what you think. Write what you know. Facts, like a soldier's after-action report, clear, concise, and accurate. Yes, Grandpa, Abigail said, her voice filled with resolve. She slipped away, her footsteps barely audible as she moved through the small apartment. Michael sat at the table for a long time, his thoughts racing. He listened to his daughter Emily stirring in her troubled sleep on the sofa, her dreams haunted by the fear of the unknown. He was a 72-year-old man with a bad hip, a veteran with limited resources and no connections. He was about to declare war on the most powerful billionaire in the city, a man who had the resources to crush him and his family without a second thought. He was terrified, but he had not felt so alive in 20 years. The next day, the library was quiet, a sanctuary of knowledge and contemplation. The air smelled of dust and old paper, a comforting scent that evoked memories of countless hours spent lost in the pages of books. Michael Grant sat on a wooden bench in the aisle-marked World War II European theater. His posture ramrod straight despite the ache in his joints. A thick book about the siege of Bastogne was open on his lap, but he was not reading it. His eyes were fixed on the entrance, scanning the faces of the patrons as they entered the library. Abigail sat on the floor a few feet away, pretending to read a book on the Roman Republic, her head bent low. She had her spiral notebook tucked inside it, her fingers nervously tapping the cover. At 4:02 p.m. Michael saw him. He was not the polished, confident reporter from the old newspaper photos, the man who had once commanded the attention of the city. This man looked like he lived in his coat. His clothes rumpled and stained, his face gaunt and unshaven. He was thin, almost skeletal, with dark circles under his eyes, a clear indication of sleepless nights and a life consumed by bitterness and regret. His hair was messy and unkempt, as if he hadn't bothered to comb it in days. He looked, Michael thought, like a man who had been defeated, a shadow of his former self. David Chun walked past the aisle, his eyes scanning the faces of the patrons, searching for a sign, a clue. He looked at Michael, his gaze lingering for a moment before moving on. He looked at Abigail, his expression softening slightly before hardening again. He scoffed, a small, bitter sound that betrayed his disappointment, and started to walk away, dismissing them as irrelevant. He had expected a corporate whistleblower, a disgruntled partner, someone with power and influence, not an old man with a cane and a fourth grader. "Mr. Chun?" Michael called out, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the library. David stopped, his shoulders slumping with resignation. He turned around slowly, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and weariness. "Mr. Grant," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for coming," Michael said, his voice filled with sincerity. "This is my granddaughter, Abigail." David's eyes flicked to Abigail, then back to Michael, his expression hardening. "What is this? A joke? You're pulling a joke on me?" "This is no joke, sir," Michael said, his voice unwavering. "You brought a child into this?" David said, his voice laced with disbelief. "What is this? A Make-A-Wish Foundation visit? You want me to write a story about your smart grandkid? I told you, I'm not a reporter anymore. I don't write those kinds of stories." "She is the reason we are here," Michael said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She is the source, the key to unlocking Harrington's secrets." "The source," David repeated, his laugh a harsh, dry sound that echoed through the aisle. "The source for what? The cafeteria menu? Get out of my way. I don't have time for this." He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped with resignation. "Project Nightingale," Abigail said, her voice not loud, but it cut through the dusty air like a knife, stopping David in his tracks. David Chun froze, his back to them, his body rigid with shock. He did not move for a full 5 seconds, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Slowly, he turned around, his movements deliberate and cautious. He looked at Abigail, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Abigail stood up, her small frame radiating an aura of quiet strength. She held herself with a strange adult stillness, her eyes fixed on David's with unwavering resolve. "Project Nightingale is the shell company," she said, her voice clear and flat, as if she were reciting a multiplication table. "You thought it was a company called Arya Investments when you wrote your article. You were wrong. Arya was a decoy, a diversion to throw you off the scent. The real one is Nightingale. It's registered as a 501c3 charity, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping children. That's how he's washing the money, hiding it in plain sight." David took a step closer, his eyes narrowed with disbelief. He was not laughing now. He was not skeptical. He was listening intently, his mind racing to connect the dots. How do you know that name?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I saw the diagrams on Mr. Harrington's whiteboard," Abigail said, her voice calm and measured. "He's taking bribes from Councilman Davies for the new waterfront project. But Davies doesn't pay him directly. The bribe money is donated to Project Nightingale. It looks like a clean, charitable gift to build a new hospital wing. But it's not." David stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what she was saying. "How? How does the money doesn't stay there?" Abigail continued, her eyes locked on his, her voice unwavering. "The charity then has expenses, legitimate-looking expenses. It pays for financial management and construction oversight from a company called Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings is run by a man named Robert Shaw. Mr. Shaw is also listed as the treasurer of Project Nightingale. The money goes in clean and comes out dirty. It's not a donation. It's a laundromat, a sophisticated scheme to conceal the flow of illicit funds." David leaned against the bookshelf, his legs suddenly weak. He looked as if he'd been punched in the stomach, his breath knocked out of him. "Ooh, I had Shaw," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "I knew Apex was dirty, that they were involved in something shady, but I couldn't tie it to Harrington. I couldn't find the bridge, the connection that would expose his involvement. Nightingale, my God." He looked from Abigail to Michael, his eyes searching their faces for any sign of deception. "Who are you people? What is this? How did you find out about this?" "I am Michael Grant," Michael said, standing up with the help of his cane, his voice filled with quiet dignity. "My daughter Emily was Walter Harrington's night cleaner, the woman who kept his penthouse spotless. He found my granddaughter in his library, a place that he considered his private domain. She was reading physics, quantum mechanics," Abigail added quietly, her voice barely audible. "Heisenberg's uncertainty principle." David let out a shaky breath, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was hearing. I've heard rumors about that library," he said, his voice filled with awe. "They said he bought it all for show, that he couldn't even understand the titles. He used it as a prop, a symbol of his wealth and intellectual superiority." "He couldn't," Abigail said, her voice filled with contempt. It made him angry, frustrated that he couldn't grasp the concepts. "He said people like us, my mother, were born to serve, that we were destined to clean his toilets and shine his shoes. He said my grandfather was just a grunt who followed orders, a mindless drone incapable of independent thought." She paused, her voice hardening with anger. "Then he fired my mother, blacklisted her from every agency in the city, and made sure she couldn't get a job anywhere. He destroyed her life because she dared to challenge his authority." David Chen's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed with a deep, familiar anger, a rage that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He recognized the pattern, the modus operandi of a man who reveled in the destruction of his enemies. He had lived it. Harrington didn't just win. He had to annihilate his opponents, to crush them beneath his heel and leave them broken and humiliated. He had to ruin them, to strip them of their dignity and their self-respect. "This is real," David said, his voice low and filled with conviction. "You are telling me this 10-year-old girl, she memorized all of this? She has Harrington's entire operation stored in her mind?" Michael put a hand on Abigail's shoulder, his touch both protective and proud. "My granddaughter has a gift," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "She sees something, and she never forgets it. She has been in that penthouse for 6 months, listening, watching, absorbing every detail. She has his entire operation in her head, every transaction, every meeting, every phone call." And Michael added, in this, he took the spiral notebook from Abigail and handed it to David, his eyes filled with anticipation. David's hands shook as he opened it, his eyes scanning the pages with growing disbelief. It was page after page of diagrams, dates, license plate numbers, names of shell companies, full sentences from phone calls Abigail had overheard. It was the raw intelligence Michael had promised, the key to unlocking Harrington's secrets. It was the skeleton key to Harrington's empire, the proof he had been searching for. A bank statement, a wire transfer, an email. How do we get our hands on that stuff? Michael questioned. David glanced down at the notebook again, his finger landing on one of the names Abigail had circled repeatedly. We target the weakest link, David stated firmly. Robert Shaw, the money guy, the CEO of Apex and the treasurer for Nightingale. A shark like Harrington never gets his own hands dirty. He uses guys like Shaw. Shaw is the one committing the fraud. He's the one who's gonna end up doing hard time if this all comes crashing down. Harrington will throw him to the wolves in a heartbeat to save his own skin. So we find him, Michael said, matter-of-factly. We scare him straight, David countered. We make him think the whole operation is going down and that Harrington is gonna let him take the fall. We make him realize that his only play is to become a state's witness. We get him to hand over the proof we need in exchange for a get-out-of-jail-free card. How? Abigail asked, her brow furrowed. David looked at the two of them, the seasoned veteran and the prodigy. It was the most unconventional team he'd ever been a part of. I'm gonna have to do some digging, David explained. I need to find out where Shaw eats, where he gets his drinks, where he hangs his hat. I need to pinpoint his weakness. You two, you've accomplished the impossible. You've handed us the weapon. Now you gotta trust me to aim it. Go home. Keep a low profile. Under no circumstances are you to go anywhere near that building or anyone connected to Harrington. I'll reach out to you. He snatched up the notebook. Can I? Michael started to ask, but Abigail interjected. She made a couple more copies last night. From memory. David Chin stared at Abigail, a look of astonishment on his face. He let out a short, surprised laugh. He definitely messed with the wrong family. Yes, sir, Michael replied, gripping his cane tightly. For 3 days, a heavy silence hung over the small apartment. Emily Grant left every morning and returned every evening. Her shoulders slumped a little further each day, her face a shade paler. The rejections were piling up. No one was willing to hire a woman who had been blacklisted by Harrington's referral agency. She had even started applying for jobs at fast food restaurants, but even they seemed hesitant. Michael and Abigail stuck to their routine. They went to the public library. They read. They waited. Abigail could see the weight of the situation etched on her grandfather's face. He was spending hours on the phone with the Veterans Affairs office, trying to see if he could get an advance on his meager pension. He was constantly checking the pantry, counting the remaining cans of beans. They were running out of time. They were running out of food. On the 4th night, the phone rang. It was nearly 11 p.m. Emily was already asleep, completely drained. Michael answered it. Grant Residence. A low, urgent voice rasped. It's me, David Chin. I've got him. Michael was instantly alert. He signaled to Abigail, who moved to his side. What did you find? Michael asked, his voice low. Shaw. He's not just a criminal, he's a desperate man, David said, speaking quickly. I followed him. He doesn't frequent fancy bars. He's not seeing another woman. He goes to one place, the city hospital. The real one, not the Nightingale wing. Why? Michael pressed. His son, 9 years old, leukemia. He's been there for 6 months. The treatment is experimental and unbelievably expensive. Harrington isn't just paying Shaw. He's exploiting him. Shaw is completely trapped. He's been cooking the books for Harrington for 5 years, and I'd bet my life Harrington is dangling those medical bills over his head. My God, Michael whispered, horrified. He's using a fake children's hospital to launder his bribes and blackmailing a man whose child is genuinely sick. It's the ultimate leverage, David said grimly. And it's our point of vulnerability. A man like that is living in constant fear. He's not loyal. He's a prisoner. What's the plan? Michael asked, his voice tight. I'm at the hospital now in the parking garage. I'm gonna confront him when he comes out. This is it, Michael. Win or lose, this ends tonight. I needed you to know. Be careful, son, Michael said, his voice full of concern. David hung up. Abigail looked at her grandfather, her eyes wide with worry. Is Mr. Chin gonna be okay? He's a good soldier, Michael said, putting his arm around her. Now we pray. The hospital parking garage was cold and reeked of motor oil. David Chin sat in his beat-up 1998 sedan. At 11:32 p.m. Robert Shaw emerged from the elevator. Shaw looked like hell. His suit was rumpled, and he hadn't shaved. He was just a father, utterly consumed by grief and terror. David Chin got out of his car. "Mr. Shaw," David called out. Shaw whirled around, his keys clutched tightly in his hand. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is David Chin. I used to be a reporter." Shaw's face went ashen. I have nothing to say to you. Leave me alone." He fumbled with his keys, desperately trying to unlock his car. "I'm not here for a story, Mr. Shaw," David said, stepping into the dim light. "I'm here to offer you a way out." "A way out of what? I don't know what you're talking about." "Project Nightingale," David stated. Shaw dropped his keys. They clattered loudly on the concrete floor. "Apex Holdings," David continued, his voice calm, almost gentle. "Councilman Davies, the waterfront bribes. I know everything, Robert, and soon everyone will." Shaw began to tremble uncontrollably. "You don't know, you can't. Mr. Harrington will destroy you." "He destroyed me 3 years ago," David said, his voice flat. "I have nothing left to lose. But you do. You have a wife. You have a son. Room 412. Leukemia." Shaw let out a choked sob. Please. He'll cut me off. He pays for the treatment. My son will die. Please, you can't." "He's already cutting you off, Robert," David said, stepping closer. "Don't you see? You're the treasurer. You're the CEO. Your signature is on every illegal transfer. When this blows up, and it will blow up, who do you think is going to prison? Him or the guy who signed the checks?" Shaw leaned heavily against his car, his legs buckling beneath him. He knew it was the truth. "He's going to feed you to the wolves," David said, his voice laced with conviction. "He'll claim you were a rogue employee. He'll act shocked and appalled. He'll walk away scot-free. You'll spend the next 20 years behind bars. And what happens to your son then? What do you want?" Shaw whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not working for a newspaper," David said. "I'm working with people who want justice. I'm building a case for the FBI, a RICO case. And right now, all the evidence points to you as the mastermind." "No, I know. But I need one piece of hard evidence that links it all back to him." David held out his hand. "I need the real ledger, a wire transfer receipt, something that has his name on it. You give me that, and I'll give you a lifeline. You become a state's witness. You get immunity. You get protection. You get to save your family. And he gets what's coming to him." Shaw looked at David's outstretched hand. He was weeping uncontrollably, a man at the absolute end of his rope. He made me keep a second set of books," Shaw whispered, his voice barely audible. As insurance. He said it was for taxes, but it's the real ledger. It shows the money coming from Davies and going out to his personal offshore accounts. It's on a USB drive in my briefcase." "Give it to me, Robert," David said, his voice firm but gentle. "And be free." Shaw fumbled with his briefcase. He pulled out a small black USB drive and placed it in David's hand. "It's all there," Shaw said, his voice filled with despair. He's a monster." "I know," David said, closing his hand around the drive. "Go back to your son, Mr. Shaw. Get some sleep. A federal agent will be in touch with you tomorrow morning." David Chin walked away, the small piece of plastic feeling incredibly heavy in his pocket. He had him. He had Harrington. 2 weeks later, Walter Harrington stood on the stage of a grand ballroom. It was the annual City Foundation Gala. Hundreds of the city's elite, dressed in tuxedos and gowns, applauded enthusiastically. He was at a podium, accepting the Philanthropist of the Year award for his generous and groundbreaking work funding Project Nightingale. Thank you, Harrington said, smiling broadly, his voice smooth and confident. "We in this room have a duty to lead, a duty to give back. and I am proud to lead the charge." The applause was deafening. At the back of the ballroom, two men in dark blue suits spoke into their wrists. "He's on stage. We're moving in." The main doors of the ballroom swung open. Two FBI agents walked in, followed by two more. They were not in tuxedos. They walked calmly and directly toward the stage. The applause began to fade, and the room fell silent. Harrington stopped smiling, a look of confusion spreading across his face. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The lead agent walked up the steps to the stage, joined by a fifth man, David Chin. Harrington's face turned to stone. "Chin, what is the meaning of this? I'll have you thrown out." "Security." "Walter Harrington," the lead agent said, his voice booming in the now silent room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bribery, and money laundering." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "This is outrageous," Harrington shouted, his face red with anger. "You have no proof. This hack," he spat, pointing at David, "has been fabricating lies about me for years." "We don't need his lies," the agent said calmly. He held up a small plastic bag containing the USB drive. "We have your ledger. We have all your offshore accounts. And we have the full sworn testimony of your partner, Mr. Robert Shaw." The color completely drained from Walter Harrington's face. He finally understood. He had been outmaneuvered. The agents pulled his hands behind his back, and the sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the ballroom. What he did next shocked everyone. David Chin thought as he watched the billionaire being led off the stage. In a small apartment across town, the television news was buzzing. "Taken away in handcuffs in front of the city's most powerful people. Walter Harrington, the man who essentially owned this city, is finished." Emily Grant sat on the sofa, her expression blank. She wasn't crying, just still. Michael Grant sat beside her, his hand resting on her back. Abigail sat on the floor, watching the screen intently. She watched the man who had called her mother a servant and her grandfather a grunt being led into the back of a police car. He looked so small and insignificant. The news anchor cut to a reporter on the scene. David Chin, surrounded by microphones. "Mr. Chin, your reporting has finally been vindicated. How do you feel?" David looked directly into the camera. He looked exhausted, but he was smiling. "I feel like, for the first time in a long time, the right people won. Mr. Harrington made a fatal mistake. He underestimated the people he hurt. He thought they were invisible. He forgot that the people who clean the floors and work in the kitchen see everything." The news anchor came back on. An incredible turn of events, a story of greed, corruption, and ultimately, justice, all brought about by an anonymous tip. In the apartment, Michael turned off the television. The room was silent. Emily let out a long, slow breath. "It's over," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. Michael looked at Abigail and gently stroked her blonde hair. "You did it, my girl. Your grandfather is so proud of you." Abigail looked up at him. She thought about Mr. Harrington and his library full of books he never read. "He was right about one thing, Grandpa," she said. Michael looked at her, puzzled. "What's that, sweetheart?" "He said the world is divided into two types of people." Abigail picked up her backpack and pulled out a book from the library. It wasn't physics. It was a thick, heavy book, The Fundamentals of Contract Law. "He was just wrong about which was which," she said. She opened the book, took out a pencil and began to read. "And that's where we'll conclude this story. With justice prevailing not through armies or brute force, but through a book of contract law in the hands of a young woman who was never expected to be in this position. I hope this offered you a moment to escape the mundane and simply unwind. I'd be curious to know what you were doing while listening. Perhaps enjoying a quiet cup of coffee or settling down for the evening. Feel free to share in the comments. I genuinely read them all. And if you'd like to ensure our paths cross again, hitting the like button and subscribing makes a significant difference. We're constantly striving to improve, so don't hesitate to share your feedback below. Thank you for spending this time with me.